Hello and welcome to the FF News Virtua Arena. I'm your host, Doug McKenzie, and on today's episode, we're going to be looking at how scams and frauds are changing the payments and the financial space for millions around the world. And joining us in the lead up to International Fraud Week, we have ACI Worldwide's Tanya Kopytina. Tanya, how are you doing?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
It's an absolute pleasure. And Tanya, could you tell our viewers a bit more about your role at ACI Worldwide and ACI Worldwide, please?
Of course, I'm a fraud consultant at ACI Worldwide, the global real-time payment software company. My main focus is to protect our clients and customers from emerging fraud threats and risks that could be associated with the introduction of the new payments technology to the market. I'm particularly passionate about machine learning, advanced analytics, and automation, and how it all can be applied by our clients, by banks and financial institutions to address their problems with scam and fraud.
Thank you so much. And I think that's going to be a really interesting perspective because if there's one segment of finance that's changed the most, it's payments. And people are catching up. And as a result, I think they might be becoming the weakest link, but we'll talk about that later. Now, also joining us, we have GlobalData's Samuel Murrant. Samuel, how are you doing here this morning?
Very well, thanks, Doug.
Samuel, thank you so much also for joining. Could you also tell our viewers a bit more about yourself and GlobalData, please?
Absolutely. So I'm the lead analyst for payments at GlobalData. I've been working with ACI on reports like this for a number of years in my role as a consultant as well on the GlobalData side. So GlobalData, we are a leading analyst house and research company. We provide data on 19 separate verticals, of which banking and payments is only one. I'm specialized in payments, and I look extensively at e-commerce, at fraud, at scams, and at consumer level data relating to all of that.
Very exciting. Yeah, I'd love to hear some of the stats from that report. I always love juicy numbers and some real use cases, guys. So I think to set the scene, it's very obvious to talk about 2020, but if I could then go on a bit further and dive bit deeper, Tanya, could you tell us what factors besides the pandemic are causing scams around the world to rise?
Sure. In my view, the first factor is the mature and advanced fraud detection systems that many banks currently have. I know it might sound counterintuitive at the first glance, but let me explain what I mean by that.
Please, yeah.
Uh, As fraud detection systems have become more sophisticated, criminals have turned their eyes to a more vulnerable and unprotected part of the financial services chain, the bank customers themselves, right? The criminals started to exploit human nature because they simply can't bypass fraud detection technologies anymore. Another reason is just the rise of digital and real-time payments, right? New technology, they always introducing new risks, often unknown and unpredictable at the start. As a customer myself, I love being able to send and receive money in real time, but so can do criminals, right? So payments can have moved to the real time space as well. And we, as a technology provider, we need to protect the integrity of the real time payment system to make sure that scam is not slowing down the adoption rate of the real time payments worldwide.
Yeah,
Oh, and just sorry, one point
please.
I just forgot to mention is the lack of regulation worldwide as well. Like with this shift from from fraud to scam, I think that shift has not been met with an appropriate level of regulation. What I mean by that is, at the end of the day, regulations can vary from country to country, but it's often the result then it is a genuine customer. The customer ends up being financially responsible for all of the losses associated with scams, which is, I think it's not fair to the end user, to the customers.
Yeah, and you've mentioned there, Tanya, a distinction between fraud and a scam. Could you tell our audience a bit more about
Yeah,
that, please?
yeah, of course. And I think that's there's a like whole industry struggling to define the boundaries between the scam and fraud. In my view, scam it's something that been basically facilitate when genuine customer facilitated criminals to make that scam happen, right? When genuine customer provided criminals with one-time password, internet banking access, so that just basically authorized type of legal activity, while fraud is completely unauthorized. Genuine customers are completely unaware of the basically activity that is happening on their accounts. I think that's the main difference in my view.
Interesting. Brilliant. Now, one thing that I don't know if anyone's been watching Netflix, for instance, we've noticed that there's different types of fraud targeting humans, for instance, as you mentioned there, Tanya. So, Samuel, with that in mind, could you tell us what an APP scam is and why is that on the rise?
APP fraud, the acronym stands for Authorized Push Payment Fraud. So, meaning that the payment itself is authorized. And that comes about as Tanya was mentioning, as a result of scams rather than technological based attacks on systems. So it is attacks on the human element in the chain. The purchase is authorized by the actual user, but the payment is made under false pretenses. So, for example, to buy a product that turns out to not exist, and then the person on the other end goes silent, to make a transfer to someone who purports to be in a position of authority, for example, the revenue service or the health service. That was one that came up a lot in the pandemic, and the post office as well, as a result of increased e-commerce activity. We have your parcel, just click this link and we'll give you a tracking number, and the link takes you somewhere else, and you put in your details and you've made a transfer. That sort of attack. Or people posing as potential romantic partners even, and extracting money that way.
Oh my goodness.
So these are all kind of variations on the central theme of attacking the human element in the chain, getting the actual credentials from the actual user to bypass all the security measures that are in place, in order to get access to a consumer's funds.
I mean, that's
on the
particularly
fraudster's behalf.
Yeah, that's particularly devious to target, well, during 2020, using healthcare providers as a kind of way in, or loved ones. It just shows that to target the human, people are having to become even less human, and it's really quite disgusting, and it seems almost impossible that we can educate against this. But if the customers themselves are the weak link and are almost, I hate to use this phrase, but actually siding with the scamsters, why should the banks be accountable for APP scams?
Banks provide facilities and technologies to make those payments possible, right? They should be responsible for the services and technologies they provide to their customers. Secondly, banks have lots of customers' data. They know more about their customers and their typical behavior than the customer knows about themselves, right? So they are better equipped to detect and prevent the suspicious activity that could be happening on a customer account. And lastly, I think the liability should not be only on the sending end, but also on the receiving end, on the beneficiary, right? On the banks who were unable to detect so-called mule activities. So the whole chain of the criminal activities, a criminal activity should be disrupted, and we should take all out as an industry overall. We should be responsible, and we should all take action, whether it's a remitter or the beneficiary bank, vendor or technology provider, regulators, scheme and intermediary, and the customer themselves as well.
I mean, that's such a fascinating way to look at it. It's holistically across the industry rather than one kind of profit margin for one bank. The whole industry has to gather. So, Samuel, if I could ask, what are the predicted losses for banks then if they do become accountable from this type of scam?
Yeah, so we've done a study in the US, the UK, and India to support this series, to look at how much exactly is being lost in APP fraud versus card fraud. And the results show that authorized push payment fraud is growing at around a 20% compound annual growth rate from 2020 to 2025. Wow. So the last 2 years and the next 3 years, we're going to see about 20% more fraud each year in terms of losses on authorized push payment from the bank's perspective than we did in the preceding years, and that's going to keep growing on itself. We're looking at around 1 to 1.5 billion in the UK in terms of APP fraud losses, around 3 billion by 2026 in the US, and India around $600 million in total APP fraud losses. You compare that to card fraud, the trend is flat. We're looking at very little growth or negative growth in the case of the UK. In both the UK and India, card fraud losses are on their way to being overtaken by APP fraud losses. Not so in the US. There's still quite a bit more card fraud losses there than an APP, but also there's no Fed now hasn't launched there yet, so we still are waiting on that big real-time payment system that will increase growth in real-time payments, and as a result will attract fraudsters to the platform and to this form of payment as a means for scamming, extracting money from consumers.
It's almost sad to think that innovation is going to bring more scams. But Tanya, could I also get your perspective as well in finding out? Samuel also brought up this brilliant perspective from your guys' report where you looked at the US, India, and the UK. I'd love to also get your perspective as well. I mean, Samuel brought up the brilliant thing about Fed now bringing in real time to America, but where it stands currently, what are you seeing in America, for instance?
Mhm. So in the US, the main type of financial crime is still card fraud. Being attacks, online data compromises, or ATM skimming events, although identity fraud and account takeover are on the rise as well. The US is still yet to introduce the countrywide real-time payments ecosystem, right? But I believe that America is in a good place to learn from other markets such as India or Australia, where those technology has been introduced already, right? So that America would be able to get technologically ready and with all required regulations in place. So for Indian market, scams take place in form of the UPI, which stands for the Unified Payments Interface. That's their real-time payments ecosystem. And for the local customers, if customers basically participated in some ways in a transaction or in a payment, customer are going to be left responsible fully for the financial loss.
So Sam, I am obviously a resident of the UK, so I'd also love to deep dive a bit further into a card mature market like the UK. I know you mentioned some stats earlier, but is there anything that consumers should be aware of?
Yeah, so I card fraud is a relatively understood form of fraud to be a victim of in the UK, in all the markets we're looking at, really. So we at GlobalData ran and have been running a consumer survey that touches on fraud as well as a variety of other topics for a number of years at this point. And whenever we ask around concern about different types of fraud, the top theme is consistently across the last 2 years when we've asked what type of fraud are you most worried about, it's online card detail theft. This is the one that consumers understand, they know about. It's a major theme in just public consciousness around what to watch out for. The second most important thing that consumers are concerned about is identity theft, so having their details stolen in some way. Both of these are attacks on information, which are usually around the fraudster gaining access to enough information to independently of the consumer impersonate them and make a purchase in some way. So that's what consumers are worried about. What's really happening more so is, as we mentioned before, APP fraud, APP scams being on the rise, and the losses from that going up 20% compounding every year from 2020.
That's insane.
And by this year, really, we're expecting APP fraud losses to overtake card fraud losses in the UK. And what that means is that consumers are thinking more so about the type of fraud that was more relevant a few years ago, comparatively, because it's just had more time to filter into the consciousness. But it's going to be more so that we are now starting to worry about scams, confidence tricks, things that are trying to get the consumer to act on behalf of a fraudster or to directly deliver that information that they are looking to have in order to make the transfers through a real-time payment system on behalf of a fraudster. So I think that's a trend in general. As we mentioned in the US, we're not at that point yet. It's still very much card-based, but then FedNow hasn't launched yet. And it's always a matter of the fraudster going for the path of least resistance.
Least resistance, yeah.
So it's whatever's easiest to do, whatever is not being protected adequately or as much as other ways are being protected. As Tanya mentioned earlier, technology is now really quite sophisticated and effective at thwarting a lot of technology-based attacks, a lot of hacking, although it does still happen. We are seeing more so fraudsters move to lower level human element type attacks.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost strange to think that the finance industry has evolved technologically so fast that the customers are now playing catch up. I swear, I'd never be thinking that even 5 years ago. Now, Tanya, Samuel brought up a couple of similarities and a couple of disparities as well across these markets. And I know you brought up yourself that the industry needs to kind of come together and collaborate. But, are there any similarities that you see from scams across these markets? And what insights can banks in these regions take to combat fraud together?
Of course. Yeah, so this common shift from fraud to scams, it's been like a global phenomenon, and this shift has not been supported by the appropriate level of regulation, as we all agreed upon. And from my perspective, I think banks, they need to be ready for this upcoming shift with the right technology in place, right? That includes getting right amount and relevant data into one enterprise-wide platform, including authentication data or customer biometrics, specifically addressing remote access scams, right? When banks combine all of the data together, they are able to build a more holistic, but at the same time granular view of their customers and their typical customer behavior, so they can be better equipped to uncover those scam patterns from their data. Another important aspect I would like to mention is that, in my view, banks, they need to facilitate and set up direct communication with their customers, right? To build in educational campaigns to educate their customers about current issues and how their customers can protect themselves. And also set up some systems to be able to send notifications to their customers to basically notify them about the risks of the transactions their customers are attempting to make in forms of SMS messages, push notifications, WhatsApp, or even the emails. So basically to protect their customers, to make sure that they are transactions, because banks, they are aware of this risk, right? With a huge amount of data in place, with this very sophisticated profiling and machine technology, they know what's happening. So that's just their responsibility to convey that knowledge to the end user, to the customers.
Now, that must seem like such a hard task for the banks to do, to have to educate their consumers, their customers, because the fraudsters aren't going to be playing by the rules. So it's such a very difficult task, but it's such a noble task and it's such an important task. So I'm intrigued to see how that's going to play out. Now, Sam, could you tell our viewers a bit more about the report that you've been working on at GlobalData and ACI Worldwide, please?
Yeah, so a lot of the results, obviously, I've touched on already. Essentially, this report looks at, through a couple of different lenses, the rise in authorized push payment scams, and puts it in context with the wider payments market. So we're looking at how has authorized push payment fraud risen in the past few years and into the forecast period. And to support that, we've done an extensive program of research to find out what are the losses on the ground, what is being reported by the central organizations, and what is being seen by the banks in these three key markets, how much is actually being lost, and comparing that to our own internal data on card fraud losses. And I've already sort of talked about how the comparisons work there. UK, APP fraud is overtaking card fraud. US, card fraud is still very much higher. India, APP fraud overtook card fraud ages ago, and that trend will just continue because most payments are on the UPI system, as Tanya mentioned. And then looking at consumer level results as well. So I've touched on the survey also. That study, which we conducted this year and we have been conducting since 2018, looks at how many consumers are victims of fraud? What types of fraud are they reporting suffering? And we're seeing things like identity theft, confidence tricks, tricked into giving my details to a fraud. So those are all rising over the years we've looked at it, whereas card-based fraud incidence is lowering. And then going into a little bit deeper, we asked things around, what kind of scams are there out there? And that's where I get the information, such as product-based scams are top in the UK, US, and India, actually all three. It's about a lot of these scams are around, we have something to sell, would you like to buy it? And then the product never materializes once the payment is made. That sort of, online marketplace, peer-to-peer kind of low-level scam where it's just something is advertised and then between individuals rather than person and merchant.
Yeah, I imagine, and I could be wrong in this, but you often, if you trawl through social media, you see things on either marketplaces or on Instagram, and they're almost pushed towards you, and there's no real way to get a kind of a view on it. And so I guess what you did, Sam, when you looked into e-commerce as well over the last couple of years, that really must have been such a hive of activity for scams and fraud. Now, Tanya, could I also ask, I think if we can start wrapping up, what is your advice to financial institutions to take away from Fraud Awareness Week?
Okay, I would like to give an advice not only for financial institutions, but the whole industry, for all of the parties who is involved in the payment ecosystem, right? Including like remitters, beneficiaries, like receiving and ending banks, receiving and sending bank, vendors for ourselves as well, and technology providers and regulators, and basically everyone, just to better collaborate, to take responsibility, to basically increase the awareness towards the scam issues and to protect our customers. That's our end goal for all of us.
Yeah, because it's not really a business differentiator. It's not a competition point. It really should be a moment of the industry coming together. I'd love to hear this, to see this perspective played out on, and Samuel as well. Could I also get your perspective, your advice, your insights for maybe as well, just like Tanya did, the whole industry rather than just the FIs?
Yeah, so I think I'd want to highlight that this isn't a trend that is going to go away, and it's not one that is easily solved by technology. So we've already talked about how the role of technology in the cycle here is really to push fraudsters into the path of least resistance in some ways. The fact that there is so much difficulty now and so much increasing difficulty as fraud prevention gets smarter and harder for criminals to crack, they're just going to move away from trying to do so. We may still see some successful attacks, but a lot of things are going to move to the human element in the value chain. And I think outside of just, fraud losses are on the rise from this and banks stand to lose money and the ecosystem as a whole stands to lose money, I think the other part of this really is around trust. And it's around not only the money you lose from directly as a result of fraud, and maybe you do or don't reimburse your customer as a result of it. I would argue that as an institution, it should be incumbent that consumers are reimbursed because of the second factor here, really, which is that if you suffer financial fraud as a customer, there's about a 25% chance or better in the last couple of years that you either close your account completely, move to a different provider, or stop using a certain channel that you think you suffered fraud at. So these things disconnect the customer from the channels they were currently using, which are the revenue streams that the industry depends on. Payments on e-commerce, for example, if the consumer thinks that they suffered fraud as a result of card detail entry online or other payment detail entry online, or it was a result of shopping online in some way, or if the bank didn't sort of adequately look after them after suffering fraud, then they might just pack up that relationship entirely, move somewhere else, or move to something else. This is sort of how you lose customers and all the revenue that they represent throughout the value chain, not just this is how much it costs the institution as a result of the direct fraud losses. It also costs them a customer and maybe all of their friends as well as a result of recommendations. So I think there's a lot to be sort of seen, a lot that is unseen rather.
Yeah.
In terms of negative impacts.
And especially when people, for instance, bank with their parents' bank, you're taking out generational levels of income there as an institution. So that's absolutely fascinating to see that kind of soft loss that continues down the chain. Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure getting your insights into this really fascinating topic, because it affects us all. It used to be this thing where you think, oh, you must be quite silly to be scammed, but now actually you realize that the fraudsters, the scamsters, have become a whole nother level of devious to attack this weakest link in the chain, and that is us. So thank you both for providing your insights. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves too.
Thank you.
It's really good, thanks.
Guys, also, I've got to say a big thank you to our viewers too. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at ffnews.com, and of course YouTube, but especially LinkedIn, where you'll see me in the comments. I hope you both have an absolutely brilliant International Fraud Awareness Week, and goodbye.